Okay, I'm back, and tonight I'm working on making a mask, practicing um, with the back stitch. I'd used the running stitch on the other masks, and I thought, well, this might be a fun video to show another method of sewing. If you're in a hurry, you can use the running stitch. If you're just trying to make a mask in a hurry, or if you just have the time and you want to practice your hand stitching techniques, the masks are a fun way to practice those. And this is the front side of the back stitch. It almost looks like a machine sewn stitch. Each stitch meets up with the one before perfectly. This is the back of what a back stitch looks like. And it's the strongest stitch you can make by hand to form a seam in a garment or any project you're working on. The back stitch is a super sturdy stitch that will hold your project together very well. And that's where I was thinking, well, that would be a good technique to teach somebody who wanted to learn how. And these masks are going to get a lot of wear and tear, so that'd be a fun project to work on. It takes just a tiny bit more time to sew up by the back stitch, but this is how it's formed. This is the side seam of the mask where I'm working on the tie, and you can see where the needle starts at the end of the stitch before. Try to make the stitches evenly spaced. Just pull it out. Your needle stays on the same side of the fabric, so it's a lot less chance of getting your thread tangled and confused on which side you've come through the fabric on. I've had to cut my thread in other projects many times and start over because I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing, and I like doing the back stitch because the needle stays uniform in the same side of the fabric. So here is how it's done. Here's the stitch if you can see it. I'm sorry the thread is the same color as the project. There's the thread, there's where it ended in this hole. So you can use that hole as a guide for each stitch you make. Just go back down through that hole. Come up an even space apart. It'll still catch the pleats really well. Try to keep your needle straight, it'll keep your stitch straight. And then just pull it through. It's really simple. Each of the back stitch, you want to kind of tug on your thread and make sure each stitch is pulled tight. It's formed a little differently than running a running stitch, because it's meant to hold securely. Every seam holds secure where it just will not unravel and come undone on you. So there, the needle went in at the hole where the other stitch ended. Pick an even space to bring your needle back through. Pull your thread, and I like to use my thread doubled up just to make the seam a little more secure. Some people like to just use one strand of thread, but I usually always, with everything I'm sewing, double my thread. That's just a preference I have. So here's what our last 2 or 3 stitches we've made look like. Sorry, the camera keeps getting out of focus. So we're going to start where the other stitch ended. And you don't really have to worry on the back. You can feel it with your finger. You can feel the needle is coming through all layers of the fabric. So you go down, just barely. You can feel the needle with your other hand on the other side, with the other finger, I mean. Your other hand. Okay. It's getting late, and I'm tired. So here's an even space. Needle comes through. Just do this all the way through. That way you don't have to switch stitches from the top and bottom edge to the side where the pleats are in this stitch either. The same stitch will work all the way through. If you have the time to practice it and you have, like where a few of my stitches got wonky before I wasn't paying attention. If you have time and you're wanting projects made by hand, you want to make some garments or historical sewing or embroidery. This is used a lot in embroidery and in seam making, just in garment making, I mean. Sewing seams by hand, the back stitch works wonderfully to hold garment seams closed really securely. Well, this looks like a zigzag. I'm looking through a camera lens. That's why I can't get these stitches straight, but anyway, it still shows you how they're formed. If you're not looking through a camera lens, you'll have the time and the patience to focus on each stitch, make sure everything is lined up straight. My camera is in between me and what I'm working on, so it's a little hard to see what I'm doing. This is a great project to start a kid out sewing, or a teenager. I don't think they even have home ec class with sewing in school anymore. And I had sewing in foods from probably 7th grade through senior year. I took every semester my school offered. I love sewing, so this is a really fun way. If you remember doing this as a kid, or if you have a child that wants to sew. I started embroidery sewing before I even entered school in kindergarten. I've been doing this a long time. But this is a really fun way to sit down with them and teach them something. Something that they'll always remember, and they'll be able to use it for many projects. I've made so many table runners by hand using different stitches just to practice the stitch and given away as gifts, and it's just a really fun keepsake. I have several projects that I've made. The recipients still have them hanging on their wall. They won't put them on their table. They're like, no, they're too pretty, we won't use them. But they're so much fun. I love stitching by hand. I'd rather sew by hand than machine any day. But my needle is not wanting to pull through this very easily tonight. So that's how it's done. Anyway, I like to keep my thread up above my needle so I'm not getting tangled up in it too. And so we'll pretend like this is the end of a stitch. I'll show how to make those knots again. So my camera keeps falling. Can't imagine why I have such a handy camera. Prop my little eyeglass case again. So if I was ending the stitch, I would just take my needle again underneath and pull my needle through that and make a little knot. I'll just go on ahead and make one. It won't hurt anything in the seam. And then just pull it tight. That makes a knot. Just have to do that a couple of times and then clip your thread. You're done. It'll hold. If you're finicky like me and a little worried if that will hold, then I'll just take a regular knot at the end of this thread down towards the base without going through the fabric again. But usually a couple of knots just like this, and if I do it that way, then I'll just go over the same stitch a second time. Oh, I missed that one. I pulled it too far through, but you get the idea. Just do it a couple of times in the same spot. So that's the back stitch. You learned a new stitch tonight that you can show your child or your teen, or if you're a teen and you want to learn how to sew. This one doesn't look the greatest on the back because I was working on talking too much while I was doing this, trying to see through a camera lens. But you can see on this edge, when I wasn't filming, this is what it really will look like. This is what it'll look like when you do it. It won't look like what I did there just a few seconds ago. But that's the back stitch from the back, and that's the back stitch from the front. Looks like a straight stitch on the front. It's kind of neat, and you can get kind of fancy with it. In embroidery, it's really fun when you get used to doing it. Like, I'll pretend like this is there, and you can come to the side. Like, if I wanted to make this stitch, I would come up here and start in the middle of this stitch to the side of it, come up, make my even thread, and for the next one I would come up in the middle of this one, start to the side of it, each stitch in the middle, and that makes a really pretty stitch too, and it's also a back stitch. You can do the same thing. You can come up through the bottom, and for making leaves, petals, stems, if you're making flowers and embroidery, or just want to make some fancy lettering, you can do it. You can form a back stitch in different ways. But to learn it, the easiest way is to start your stitch where the last stitch ended. And when you get more familiar with it, then you can kind of get fancy with your stitches. I'll show you down here an example of what I'm talking about, instead of just talk about it. Okay, so I have a thread in the way. I think that's what was confusing me earlier. Okay, so if I was, I do this sometimes, but when you get more familiar with it, I'm seeing where this stitch is, where we're normally starting here to make a little bit fancier back stitch. Start to the side of it and in the center and do the same thing. And then I'll start making an angled stitch all the way down your seam line. That's probably confusing you, 2 steps all in the same video, but anyway, it'll start making a little bit of a diagonal. I'll show another video, a better explanation of that. Don't worry about those 2 stitches for now, unless you understand what I'm trying to say. But for now, this is what we did. Start here, come back up, start at the end of each stitch. Make your stitches even spaced all the way through. It's fun. Ignore that though. They won't look like this. You won't be looking through a camera lens. So have fun. If you have questions, comment your questions and I will reply. Thanks.